Hello. In this lecture, we will look at art and culture from the 1960s in Europe and America to today. We won't look at art from 2016, but from as artists that are still working and living today. So um, art and culture created since the mid-20th century has been strongly influenced by the rise of various um, technological and social changes that have happened um, and had a real dramatic effect on our culture. First and foremost is the rise of the various types of media. We've seen the rise of television, first networking cable television, of course. Digital media has had a very strong influence on art and culture. And then finally, in the last decade and a half to 2 decades, the rise of internet culture and social media and the dramatic effect that that has had on art. We will also examine some of the changes that have happened, not just in how we look at art and why we look at art and how we use art, but also in the role that artists have played. In the last 60 years, art has had a significant social impact, not just in responding to social change, but in pushing society in different directions based upon the philosophies and ideologies of individual artists and of art and culture in reflection of change that's happened very quickly. You know, that's one of the things that we see happening today is with the advent of social networking platforms, the internet, and various other applications that share information in a very quick time. What we end up seeing is that art and artists play a slightly different role, and how artists use art and what they do with art and how they share their art and what form that it takes is changing very, very rapidly just in these last couple of decades. Um, we're starting to see art come out of the museum and art find its way into a more public and more social platform in ways that would never have been imagined or couldn't have been imagined prior to the changes of these and technological advances. But all that begins in the late 1950s and early 1960s with art that is responding to popular culture. And pretty much everything in the generations since has been influenced by the beginnings with pop art. And so art and culture and what we see as popular culture have had a long relationship and not always one that is complementary. Artists were in previous centuries were not always seen as being responsive to what was happening in the quote unquote popular um, mindset. That art was seen as very often seen as kind of classic and stuck in an anachronistic past. However, just in the last 50 years, what we've seen is artists are embracing their role as creating culture rather than just responding to what's happening, and they're using and they're finding unique and interesting and innovative ways to use these new media and these new outlets to both kind of publicize and market their own work, but also as a way to communicate. You know, art is a visual language, and as such, we can see that artists use these platforms like Instagram, like Facebook, um, and Snapchat and other things to get imagery out there in a very, very quick manner and get feedback from that imagery in a very quick manner. And almost every major artist active today, regardless of their media, has a presence in social media and on the internet, because it's so important to communicate with potential viewers and patrons and clients in a real time way. And all of that really has its foundations in the art of the 1960s with pop artists. And they're recognizing that the relationship between popular culture and high culture or art culture needed to be developed intentionally. And the way to do that was to encourage and to encourage people who wouldn't necessarily normally think of themselves as having a role in art culture to embrace what they see as subject matter that's meaningful to them. And we'll see that in the art of all of these different movements. So we're going to begin with pop art. And pop art is basically exactly what it sounds like. It's art that has some sort of reference, almost always through subject matter, but sometimes through style, also very often through media, with something that isn't traditionally thought of as high art. So like Roy Lichtenstein here, who embraces sort of the culture of and the imagery of comics and comic books and uses that in his paintings. Now, what's interesting about this is that initially in the art world, there's a little bit of reluctance, not so much to embrace these artistic traditions or these this style of imagery, not like you might think. It's really more a reluctance to see this as important in terms of its meaning or content. It's not a style question. Is what does it mean? Because art for the last 300 years has really focused on trying to be meaningful, almost like the other high art forms of literature or theater or music, to be able to communicate in a way that is going to express something meaningful to the audience. And so that's really the question with pop art, that or the sometimes reluctance of art, the traditional kind of high art connoisseurs to embrace pop art. It just seems like something kind of frivolous. But what the pop artists were very careful to do was to use imagery in a way that still had, like the previous generation of social commentary artists, still had a message that was relevant in their time. So here in the 1960s, Lichtenstein embraces this comic book art at a time when the world is, and America in particular, is embroiled in the Vietnam conflict and seeing what's happening with the rise of the Cold War and all of this, you know, very important social change that's happening and social issues that are happening. And he very cleverly makes commentary about what's going on by choosing not just any random comic book image, but those that have to deal with, images of war and images of conflict, because that somehow adds to a relevant discussion about what's happening in society. I think pop art at its best has the potential to be somewhat critical, or at the very least to be relevant in questioning what's happening in society. So looking at social issues, looking at the problems of society, and making a statement about it, even if that statement is to seems kind of cloaked in something that would be familiar, and that's important. Now, the most important of the pop artists is by far Andy Warhol. Warhol started out his career as an artist, as an illustrator, in marketing and in commercial illustration. We see that reflected in his work, and um, we also see his understanding of how to market not only his art but also himself. His greatest um, his greatest creation really is his persona. He's most famous for works like these. These are his paintings, both individually and collectively, of Campbell soup can labels. And while they might seem kind of simplistic and innocuous, it's important that we see his genius, really. What Warhol is most famous for doing is to understand that he doesn't have to have a great idea or powerful message with his art in order to be successful. What he needs is recognition. What he needs is fame. What he needs is notoriety. And how he gets that is by making images that are familiar, that are comfortable, and attaching his name to these very famous, very powerful, and very successful brands. So he paints Campbell's soup cans. And you might think that Campbell's wouldn't want him to, he'd somehow be violating their copyright. But by painting them, he's actually helping them, making them more known, because he's the artist who paints Campbell soup cans, and he attaches his name to their brand. So he had this kind of a symbiotic relationship to a number of products that were famous. And what ended up happening is he could um, he could use the new media. He could use television. He could use film. He was also a filmmaker, and he could use the atmosphere of New York of the 1960s through the 70s into the 80s, that where popular culture and fame and celebrity were really a trade. These were a commodity. And so how you became more famous was by uh, you know having more and more people not only just aware of who you were for or value what you did, but also simply just to know and to want to know, even if what you were known for wasn't necessarily something like it had been the previous generations of notoriety. His work is rather simplistic, but that's its genius. It doesn't have to be this high art. And actually, it made him more accessible. People saw his work and they thought, well, it's kind of charming and familiar, and we like the products, and we like the imagery, and we like the idea. And he's, in a certain way, he is the legacy. Warhol and pop art is the legacy of Duchamp and the art of the absurd of the 1920s, and the art of the of modernism. Um, what he's able to do is paint portraits of celebrities, and he paints them in such a way that they're not realistic, they're abstracted, but that's really his way of making a statement about the nature of celebrity. Warhol is most famous for his statement that's often misquoted as being 15 minutes of fame. But what he actually said, it was very prophetic, was that he believed that in the future, everyone in the world would be famous, but only for 15 minutes. And that didn't mean that he somehow thought that fame was so easily attained necessarily. He just thought that it was short-lived. And so in his, and this is very true with his art, is that, you know, the notoriety for getting a work of art in the art world in an important collection, having an important exhibition at the right gallery, and all of that being, you know, patronized by the right collectors, all of that is short-lived if you're not continuing to develop that persona, and market that idea of who you are as important as an artist, that you're going to diminish. You're either getting more famous or less famous by the minute. And so it's important that he chooses people like Marilyn Monroe and Elvis Presley and other famous celebrities as his subjects, not because their fame would somehow was somehow diminishing, although, you know, over time it would, but more so how he can become more famous by attaching his name to them, and they become more famous by attaching themselves to him. So it's this relationship, and that's ultimately what pop art is about. It's about recognizing the nature of society as a collective kind of mob mentality, that the more we talk about somebody, the more famous they become, and the more famous somebody becomes, the more people talk about him. You know, and really ultimately we're living in the world that Warhol was predicting with this sort of viral mentality of social media, and that what people are kind of willing to do, and you know, what they absolutely feel like they must do in order to maintain that internet celebrity. But Warhol really is the first to recognize the power of media to create that. Now, if Warhol's pop art is focused on this, you know, this persona, or this collective media awareness, there's a sort of a flip side to that, with a much more traditional approach of hyperrealism in pop art. Audrey Flack is the leader of that, and her artworks, her paintings, this is a painting, are hyperrealistic. She goes to great lengths to Flack's technique is so highly skilled, and her subject matter choices are um, are so familiar to her audience. Things from pop culture, you know, makeup and perfume, you know, Chanel Number 5 perfume. So in a certain sense, she's similar to what Warhol was doing with pop art, but it's the technique that is very, very traditional, and what they represent. You know, so this is very much in the same vein as the the still life paintings of the Baroque period that included things familiar to their audience, you know, subjects familiar to their audience, not only things they would recognize, but things that they preferred and that they were interested in. Now, Flack is also interesting because she's really reflecting what the changes, some of the social changes of attitudes towards women of the 60s and 70s, or as things are going through the 60s into the 70s, and we see that happen with some pretty significant uh, changes, not only with the attitudes towards women, but with women artists and their prominence. There have always been women artists, but it's the acceptance of women in the art world that has, for centuries, been quite lacking. And Flack really breaks down, and some other artists of the 70s and 80s really break down some of those barriers to allow for the role that women play in the art world today. Now, another hyperrealist painter is a man by the name of Chuck Close. Close is actually still a very, very prominent figure in the art world, and he came to some notoriety with his monumental portraits. This painting is about 10 feet wide and about 15 feet tall, and it's this very, very, very large but very realistic painting of close-up portrait. And what makes Close's work so interesting is his extraordinarily high level of resolution and detail. And he was actually using the high resolution photographs that, and always has, that have, as photography has developed, have become available to impact and how artists are able to get more realism into their drawings and paintings. Now, Close is also important because of his attitudes towards technique. Close has always been very experimental with his techniques, including using kind of the non-traditional methods as they relate to both drawing and painting. He's and I think that it's what makes the Close so interesting is that he actually is able to use these non-traditional techniques and yet still get a high level of realism. Um, since this time, as his style has evolved, his work's actually gotten more abstract. But in this period, he was a member of that hyperrealism um, movement. Now, the last of the hyperrealists that we'll look at is actually a sculptor. Dwayne Hansen became famous for his use of theatrical tools and techniques in his sculpture. So he was actually started out as a traditional sculptor, and then he actually transitioned into using latex and casting and some of the tools that they use in theater and in filmmaking to create his works. This is one of his hyper-realistic images of a tourist, a traveler. And the body here is all cast in latex around plaster, and it's very realistic. It's from an actual cast from the entire body of his model, and then every part of it has been painstaking, of the body, of the skin and the hair and everything's been painstakingly detailed. All of the other materials are real. The clothing and the hat and the shoes and the luggage, it's all real things that have just been augmented or used to augment his sculpture. But his sculptures take an extraordinary amount of time and labor to create. Every hair is placed by hand. Every inch of the figure is painted to get incredible realism in his works. Hansen and his works became famous not just for the skill and talent that they take, but for his very subtle way that he reflected kind of social changes and social strata and class system, basically. So he liked to choose as subjects for his works folks who were kind of the more blue-collar, non-typical art, perhaps, especially at a time in the 70s and 80s in pop culture where where vanity was certainly a big part of how people viewed what was happening in the mainstream media and in Hollywood and on TV. Now, so one direction that art goes is towards the hyper-realistic after pop art. And then there's another movement that comes along in the wake of pop art and moves the exact, a very different direction, moves towards abstraction. And in fact, it's an abstraction that harkens kind of back to the first American movement in art and culture of abstract expressionism. Anselm Kiefer is an important painter and sculptor who really embraces texture and sort of a non-objective way of creating imagery. Now, he was capable of a very, very high level of realism in his painting, but he's choosing to work abstractly like this. His technique creates a painting that is very much like a sculpture. In fact, many of his works are mixed media works, where it's not just paint on a canvas or a board. It's a combination of a variety of materials that create these really interesting and complicated textural surfaces. It's very, very heavy impasto, and it's a very thick surface, and you can kind of see that in the image, how there's a level of depth of that texture that is really quite fascinating. Now, as you might expect, as pop artists of the 60s embrace popular culture, one of the things that would eventually find its way into pop art, or an offspring of pop art, would be um, photography and film and movies, at least as inspiration, if not as a direct output. So this is by Cindy Sherman. Sherman is a photographer, a filmmaker, a sculptor, and she's a mixed media artist. She has been extraordinarily active over the last 40 years, creating initially first a series. She became kind of famous and known for a series of self-portraits that she made, where she took on roles of women in media, of women in movies, and so she photographed herself kind of playing these parts. And she was initially kind of enamored with the way that Hollywood represented women, especially since most of the producers and directors and writers in Hollywood, even into the 70s, were men. And so here she's kind of taking on this role of the kind of victim slash ingenue of the Hollywood movie, with this stark lighting, and she's kind of wearing the schoolgirl outfit, and she's looks like she's either sweating or wet, and she's looking up from this very kind of dark wooden floor, and you know, the idea here is that by making this self-portrait, what she's done is she's sort of taken the role away from, and taken the image away from, the male-dominated world of theater and movies, and brought it into the art world, and taken its meaning away. And um, Sherman has always been one of those artists who have pushed that boundaries of those relationships between men and women. As her career carried forward, she became famous for um, her self-portraits that were not only images of the men, but also of women playing men, and um, she was the character. So it's a really she has some very interesting imagery as it relates to connecting to pop culture. Barbara Kruger is another female artist who made kind of socially conscious art and activist art. Um, she became kind of known in the 80s for these images of graphic design and photography that combined text with her images. And then they're very public. She made these as sort of posters to put in subways and on billboards and around in various urban centers, so that people would see them. And they look very much the part of advertising. And so, like other pop artists who used advertising directly, she's actually just taking the style of advertising, and she's using it for her own efforts and effects. This is one of her more famous works, I Shop Therefore I Am, and she takes the the composition, the pose, the gesture, the look of a typical kind of credit card kind of advertisement, and uses it to make a social statement about the nature of consumerism, about the nature of identity, and that it's an important aspect of the art of the 70s, in the art world, when and the 80s, when the art world, when art was becoming a very highly traded commodity, and artists themselves were becoming commodities. And we're starting to see the legacy of Warhol as people are trading on their name. Artists are trading on their name and their fame and notoriety. Kruger used these and put them in public places because she wasn't just talking about the art world, she was talking about all of society. The fact that we tie up our identity in what we purchase and in how we purchase. And again, in this way, artists of these eras are becoming very prophetic about the changes that we're seeing happening in society today. So 30 years before, the internet and all these social media companies are tailoring the advertising to your clicks and links and searches. Kruger is saying that this is exactly who we were headed to become. And this is ultimately the power of art, and artists sort of taking the role of a social critic and a role of examining our collective conscious to understand who we are a bit more. Jeff Koons is an artist who's still very much active today. He was prominent in the 80s and 90s and well into today, obviously, in creating works that were inspired by the celebrity of social media, or the social world, of the pop culture world. He liked to make sculptures. He's a sculptor. He liked to make sculptures that kind of combine and in certain ways sort of poke fun at these figures, these characters, these persona that celebrity creates, but also in looking at how this is not really anything new. If you go back into the Baroque world, you go back into even the Renaissance world, you would see that celebrity and that famous people were inspiration for art. And so that's actually what he's done here. He's taken an image from pop culture, an image from publication. He very often uses photographs and documents from and images from media. He's been sued several times for potential copyright infringement, although he always wins because he changes it just enough. So he took a photograph of Michael Jackson and his pet chimp, and he then he changed the photograph into this porcelain figurine, and very much in the mold of, in the style of the kind of high classical figurines of the 19th century, that were very collectible. And so, what he's kind of saying is that our our performers, our musicians, our celebrities, they are kind of taking the place of our collectibles. That we want to collect them and their output, as much as in the past generations have wanted to collect these simple porcelain figures. And of course, also there's a little bit of that sort of connection um, to the odd, to the outside the norm of social traditions that Kuntz is attracted to. He likes to do things that cause people, the normal viewer, to kind of take notice. He makes these large scale structures sometimes, and it's really about taking notice. Now, in terms of sculpture, there's a movement in that began in the 80s and carried forward to today in sculpture called environmental art. And this is an art form that tries to take as its media, it's sort of sculpture, it's sort of mixed media, but tries to take as its media the earth. So it's monumental sculpture that where the earth has been somehow composed, designed, transformed to create works that are usually temporary but sometimes more permanent, that force us to sort of rethink our relationship with the earth and how we treat it and how we use it and how we live with it or do we live in trying to change it, to alter it. This is Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty. It's a very famous work created over the course of a few months by using large dump trucks to dump sand and rock and gravel and earth to create this land bridge, basically in the form of a spiral. And this was done in Utah in the Great Salt Lake, and he knew that over time, really in just a short time, relatively short time, that it was going to be kind of washed and worn away or covered by the water. But the idea here is that for that moment, for that experience, if you were there to see it, if you were there to experience it, then you got to look at this space and this place in a slightly different way. And also, if you weren't there, the art starts to there's this personality in art of the time period to look at art as an experience, as a concept more than an object. Because this is going to go away, that you either had to be there or you weren't there, or you can only see it in photographs. It's really looking at art kind of more like theater, really, than that you have to be there, rather than like an object to be collected. Also, there's nothing really here sort of to sell, and so this is in one way making that statement about the nature of art as a commodity. Now, as these environmental artists, as their ideas get bigger and more monumental, as they get more elaborate, some of the projects that they undertake, and there are still several working in this vein today, really are quite remarkable. This is the first major project in America, anyway, by an artist team by the name of Christo and Jean-Claude. Um, they create these large-scale installations that are temporary, and of course they are designed to be temporary. This is Valley Curtain, and it was created to span this valley in Arizona, and you can see that the road actually passes through it in that little archway down at the bottom of the right in the valley there. And the idea here is to really just create this experience of changing the way that we look at our environment. And Christo and Jean-Claude go to great lengths. In fact, they have to get usually special permission from every kind of city and environmental group, and to create these works to guarantee that there won't be any negative environmental impact. And they do so. It takes years usually to execute a project for them, and they do so all by and generate the funds, the millions of dollars that it takes to create these, all entirely independently. They won't take money from anyone because they think it might impact their decision making. And so what's interesting about this is the way that they're looking at sculpture and art and the world, and how we as man add beauty or take beauty away from the environment. How do we do what we do? And that's really interesting. For that the role artists have played. Is we have always traditionally seen artists adding beauty through the objects they create, and we think about the longevity of those objects, and we want them to last forever. We go to museums and we work very hard to preserve those objects, but this was never intended to be permanent. It is a temporary thing. And so we have to sort of think of it differently. We can't think of it in the same way that we think of a traditional work of art. Christo and Jean-Claude also created this surrounded islands installation with floating fabric around these islands in Biscayne Bay in Miami, and they have played an important role in changing not just the way that we see art, but the way that we see the world. They are very often seen kind of as not just artists, but activists, environmental activists, even though sometimes they get criticized for their work. They think that people sometimes think that they're taking advantage of the environment when really they are just trying to draw our attention to how we as human beings see the earth. Is the earth something, is it just raw material for us? And then again, how do we express ourselves through the way that we manipulate the earth? Now, the last of these large environmental sculptors was Richard Serra. Serra's work was very controversial because it's not quite abstract, because an abstraction really is about modifying, simplifying, stylizing from nature. But for Serra, it was really more about seeing how we manipulate space, and how the sculptor can change through their work, can change the way that not only we view space, but we use it. So he created these series of works made with these large metal plates. This is called Tilted Arc, and it was on a plaza in front of a federal building. So what happens is basically just a large piece of metal, but what we see is that as people move through the plaza, move around it, they start to understand how when we make structures, buildings, whatever, we alter the environment, we alter the space. We have to walk around, move around differently. Sound travels differently. Light travels differently. And so as such, we should be very conscious about the role that we're playing in changing our day-to-day lives, that one gesture, one object, one piece of metal can really impact the lives of thousands of people that work in these buildings and use this space. Now, there have also in the last 30 years been some very controversial styles and movements in art. And the next couple of artists and movements that we're going to talk about, the goal of these artists has been to force the viewer into answering tough questions, into reconsidering the nature of what is art, and what art should do, and what's important, how it's important for art to affect culture. The first movement was conceptual art, and as far back as the 60s, we started to see artists working conceptually, where instead of actually creating an object, they are performing. They're using their bodies and objects and things that they've made and created to create an experience. And so art, in this sense, is experienced. What you're looking at is a photograph of a work by Joseph Beuys. Beuys was a performance artist and conceptual artist who would come up with the idea for these experiences, and then perform them basically, and for a short time in a gallery space, and then the viewers would come and they would witness these performances, and the performances were documented by photographs early on, and then later by video. And we see the legacy. We still experience the legacy today. We see a strong movement in art very recently to share these kinds of performances, here we are 40 years later, almost 50 years later. But now with social media, the artists can do these and create these kinds of happenings basically, and share them in real time as they're happening. And that's a really remarkable thing that society has and the technology has allowed. But Beuys was doing this, you know, decades ago. Carolee Schneemann was another California artist. Beuys is in New York, Schneemann's in California, and she was actually creating these happenings, is what she called them, and where she would wouldn't only be her, but it would also be people she had recruited and had to work with her to create these pieces of art that are really questioning society. What is our role, and how do we relate to each other, and how do we where Beuys was interested in what it means to be an American as an outsider, as a European. Schneemann is interested in things like our relationship with our food and our relationship with she was a vegetarian, so her relationship with meat, and then the war. She made pieces of that dealt with the war as well. Now we see that carry through, conceptual art carry through, and performance art carry through into sculpture and into digital media. What's happening today, more recently in digital media, is we're seeing that, or in the last and in the last 20, 25 years or so, we're seeing the rise of digital platforms, the rise of digital video, the rise of light as a material, light as a source, and light as a sculpture. So how can you see light as a sculpture? Bruce Nyman was very famous for his works where he manipulated both the experience through light, but also the space. So he created, this is an installation work using light where the viewer walks down this very, very narrow space that he's created. It's not even really a hall. And as you walk, light sensors turn out the lights ahead of you. So you're always in the darkness looking into the light, and you move through the space of the gallery. And it's a really interesting way to look at and think about what is art and what is sculpture, that the sculpture here is really the light. And as you move through the sculpture, you are part of the experience. So the faster you move, the faster the lights turn out, and the slower you move, the more light the light will remain. It's a really interesting way to view what is the nature of a sculpture. Now, the earliest and most important of these digital artists would be Nam June Paik. Nam June Paik was Vietnamese, and he was an interesting artist in terms of the way that he used new technologies, new during the time, closed circuit TV and video loops, and create these sculptures that projected and that used cameras and TVs. It's really interesting the way that he thinks about and makes images that are both interesting aesthetically as objects, but also that have a social statement, that make a social statement. One of his most famous works is called Guadalcanal Diary, and it's a video loop and installation, and he's taken video from various sources, media, news sources, war footage and things, and he's altered it, he's edited the footage to create these silhouettes and these, take out the detail and the realism and really make it almost like a moving painting. It's a really remarkable installation. Now, more recently, there's been some very, very interesting work created by digital and mixed media artist Tony Orsler. Orsler uses projection, LCD projection, and some other new technologies to create, including artificial intelligence, to create sculptures that actually interact with the viewer. So here he's taken a video and projected it into halves. It's the same scene, so what happens is that the eyes and the mouth match up, but or obviously they operate independently, and so as the viewer stands and watches and interacts with the sculpture, the expressions will change. The sculpture will actually speak to the viewer, and it's really a very interesting way to think about using the new technologies relevant to art, and a way to create that dialogue. If art really is about communication, then why not try and create a work of art that can interact, not only, just in a static sense, but in a dynamic sense with the viewer. Now, in the late 1980s and through to today, there's been a movement in art called shock art. And the goal of this art is to shock the viewer. The goal is to try and force the viewer into being uncomfortable or even enraged by the imagery. Um, the most prominent early shock artist was Andres Serrano. Serrano was a photographer and filmmaker who chose as his subject matter the taboos that he saw in the world around him, taboos of religion, taboos of bodily fluids, taboos of um, the way that we create images and how we view images, the power that we give images and objects. And he's actually uh, created a series of images, photographs, that dealt with these taboos. And when he put them on display, they were very, very controversial. It's hard to underestimate and understate how controversial his works were. There were protests outside the exhibition spaces and galleries. There were people who were not only boycotting the galleries, but they were, threatening the um, anyone who was in any way supportive of Serrano's work and others like Serrano. This image comes from a series that he did that dealt with the Catholic Church. Now, first, Serrano is himself a devout Catholic. He has a studio in Rome, and he's from Italy, and he travels back and forth and around the globe, but with his work. But he, in one of his many times spent in Rome, trips to Rome, he noticed that outside the Vatican there were these kind of plastic figurines and little objects, souvenirs that were being sold, and they were actually being sold by Vatican souvenir shops. So this was the church selling souvenirs to visitors, and for Serrano, he saw this as sort of an an unfortunate decision, because he felt like that the church shouldn't be selling these things, first of all, and second, that the objects themselves were kind of go against what he sees as church doctrine, that the church shouldn't sell these things because it's the idea of uh, idol worship, perhaps. So he purchased several of these little plastic figurines of the Madonna and Child and the Pope and the crucifix, and he brought them back to his studio and left them there for a while until he could kind of figure out what to do with them. And then he decided to, as part of one of the series he was working on, to photograph these objects, and to do so in a way that would be suggestive of some of the taboos of bodily fluids, including blood and urine. And so, the idea is that, what is sacrilege? Is it sacrilege to immerse this object that is in itself, in his mind, the object itself is somewhat sacrilegious? Is it sacrilegious to immerse it in a bodily fluid that one finds distasteful, or um, is it causing us to reconsider what we view as sacrilegious at all? And that's really ultimately his goal. Now, the work was very, very controversial, and to the point where the church actually made him even more famous by pushing their members to not see it. So of course, you tell somebody you don't want to see it, then they immediately want to. Now, other shock artists work with other taboos, work with other, cause us to question our relationships and with imagery and with ourselves. Sally Mann is a photographer who um, made a series of images of children, almost all of them her children, that kind of deal with the nature of the naivete of children, the nature of the taboos about our relationship with children and ages and what is appropriate, what's inappropriate. Now, Mann's photographs, the difference there is that where Serrano is really forcing this shock, he really wants to push that edge. Mann is trying to be a bit more subtle with her work. It's just more of a questioning, and they're simpler, and but because her works are controversial mostly because of their the imagery of children and boundaries with children. Um, the ironic part is that Mann herself is really wants to have this conversation, but so the imagery has become so controversial in its own right that people don't want to see them. But the point is that when you see the image, you have the conversation, and that conversation is important for us in understanding our society better. In terms of sculpture in shock art, Damien Hirst is very definitely the leader, and he's still around today. Very definitely the leader of shock art and sculpture, using real sharks in his work, in this case encased in acrylic. This is a great white shark that has been um, preserved in acrylic, and it is of course, an endangered species and illegal, and protected. But that's sort of his point. He wants to make works that push us into questioning. Okay, well, what's okay in the art world? What's okay in society? We let people who have a great deal of wealth sometimes get away with things that we don't let other folks get away with. So in this case, he creates a sculpture and prices it at a point where only the very, very wealthy can afford it, and yet we somehow, because it's art, we forgive its illegality. Um, you know, as we move into kind of round this out with a look at architecture, we want to understand that the art world of today is really pushing those boundaries. We just are constantly and continuously pushing boundaries. And there are some very, very prominent artists of today that are doing just that. And I think that eventually the history will look at the time period of the late 20th, well, all through the 20th century and into the early 21st as a very important and dramatic time in art. Now, in terms of architecture, as always, kind of goes its own way, but from the period we see the work of Michael Graves. A building doesn't, and this is sort of the point, right, of architecture of the last 40 years, is we're going to start to see architects look at their buildings not just as functional objects, but as aesthetic objects, as sculptures. So a building doesn't have to just kind of play by the rules of what is a building. It doesn't have to just be like mid-century modern, like that functional building. It can have whimsy, it can be daring, it can be dangerous, it can be interesting in its own right. It's not just about what adorns it, what we decorate it with. And so early on, we have Graves and his radical use of space and combining of geometric forms. And then that sort of leads into the groundbreaking work of two French architects, Renzo and the Pompidou Center, The Pompidou Center in Paris is this really, really interesting structure about, inside and outside, and it has these walkways and these tube-like structures, and there's no real skeleton on the outside or skin on the outside. You see the workings, and the spaces are divided. And initially when this building was opened, and there's still many people in Paris who have a very serious dislike for this building, but the architects, Renzo and Piano, have become very famous for um, their willingness to push those boundaries, and really it's a remarkable structure. It's this multi-use structure that has become this iconic Paris landmark. And when it was first opened, people just absolutely railed against it for how ugly and unfashionable it was. Now, just in the last 20 years, the leading architects have been I.M. Pei, whose work we see here. This is the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and Museum from Cleveland, and Pei is known for his use of geometry and kind of startling use of texture and structure. In one sense simplistic, and in other senses very, very interesting in its drama. These structures that are anything but simple. Pei also became famous as the designer of the glass pyramid outside the Louvre. But his building style is rather interesting because he creates buildings that I think speak to, in their form, their simplicity, but their form, speak to the nature of the building. So he doesn't ever make two designs the same way. Every building is completely unique, and in that way, it's almost like a sculpture. And then finally, we look at Frank Gehry. Gehry's works. He's by far the most prominent architect of the last 25 years, and Gehry's works. This is his Musée de Bilbao in Spain. It's a Guggenheim museum, member of that Guggenheim network, and it's in Bilbao in Spain. And the building becomes a work of art. It's architecture, it's sculpture, it's this amazing space, and the way that it's designed um, to not in any way conform to the contemporary or the traditions of architecture. So where we've seen art travel in the last 50 years is a real emphasis upon creativity and an emphasis um, on the quality of the ideas rather than just the traditions of technique. All right, so that ends our look at art of this time period, and I hope you've enjoyed it.